Welcome and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching us today online. Welcome to today's event. My name is Alan Cho and I'm the co-chair of VimLock. I'm also a librarian at the University of British Columbia. With that knowledge that I am here in Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I welcome you in the audience to also share where you are joining us today. Whether you are in the United States, Canada, or in another part of the world. You can go to nativeland.ca. I have dropped it in the webinar chat box. Native Land strives to create and foster conversations about the history of colonialism, Indigenous ways of knowing, and settler-Indigenous relations. I first want to thank our sponsor for today's Zoom webinar, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, a nonprofit organization that supports volunteer organizations such as ourselves. I also like to share with you more about our work at VimLock. The Visible Minority Librarians of Canada was created in 2012 as a network within the former Canadian Library Association. Over the past decade, VimLock has provided a forum for visible minority librarians across Canada to discuss issues and concerns specifically related to the profession, with initiatives such as a mentorship program, Census of Visible Minority Librarians in Canada, and most recently, educational programs such as today's webinar. I'd like to frame our discussion for today's event. Today's event built on recent discussions in the library community about the notion of vocational awe, the set of ideas, values, and assumptions that libraries as institutions are inherently good and sacred and therefore beyond critique, and its juxtaposition on equity, diversity, and inclusion in the profession. Our discussion today features a study conducted in 2019 with librarians that identify as Asian and their experiences with entering or working toward management roles. A book chapter was published in 2022 called The Libraries as Dysfunctional Organizations and Workplaces by Silvia Vong. With that said, I'd like to welcome and introduce our speaker and presenter today, Silvia Vong. Silvia is the Associate Chief Librarian of Scholarly Research and Creative Activities at Toronto Metropolitan University Library in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. She has been working in universities for over a decade, and her Ph.D. research focuses on the impact of neoliberal conventions and managerialism on equity and anti-racism work in Canadian universities. Silvia draws on the work of critical race theory scholars, postcolonial theory, and Pierre Bourdieu to examine issues in librarianship. She identifies as cisgendered Chinese Canadian woman. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Silvia will give her presentation first, and then we'll open up the floor to questions to her. Please hold your questions until we open up the floor to questions, but you're more than welcome to enter your question into the Q&A chat box if you like ahead of time. And so when the time comes, we will select those questions and ask Silvia. Today's session is also recorded for future viewing as well. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to Silvia and welcome to the stage. Over to you, Silvia.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a bit about my research. I did this survey back in 2019 and then the pandemic hit as I was looking for places to publish. And when I chose a book, that book took quite some time during the pandemic to get off the ground. So now we're in 2023. The book was just published in the winter term or in the fall term of 2022. So I'm able to share some of the data that I've collected, and in a few months from now, I'll be able to deposit my my green OA copy into a repository openly for sharing as well. I think it was important to share what I have so far with the group and the community, and particularly those who might have participated in the study anonymously, by the way. So I just wanted to share what some of the findings were and sort of discuss institutional sort of barriers, which is what I'm really interested in as a researcher. So our land acknowledgement here, where I am, is we are in Toronto, which is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. This is our institutional land acknowledgement. And what I want to add, though, is that I think there's still a lot of work to be done at my own institution to work with not only knowledge keepers, but knowledge makers, which is a term that I've been learning about, which refers to Indigenous scholars and their needs and supports that they need to ensure that their work is done with integrity and authenticity. So it's something that I'm certainly working on in my role here, and certainly exploring and learning about Indigenous methodologies on an ongoing basis. Another acknowledgement I want to make that I think should be done is the importance of recognizing African American and Canadian and racialized scholars who, and particularly Black feminist scholars, who have built the foundations for critical race theory, and not just critical race theory, but many scholarship or scholarly pursuits and theoretical foundations. They have contributed to important conversations around pedagogy, the law, social issues, and more. I've been listening to Collected, which is a podcast that kind of revisits how Black feminist scholars have built many the groundwork for many theories, and an importance in recognizing that. So I encourage everyone to listen and learn, and also explore this further. Just a note, Asian is such a broad term. I even don't really like using the term, because Asian can encompass a large, wide-ranging group. And it shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. It's a very broad term, and it tends to essentialize our group when we all have very complex experiences from different places. For this study, it was intended to understand what structural barriers exist for people that identify as Asian. But of course, there aren't many people that identify as Asian in the field. So this makes it very difficult, because as soon as you start to really break down ethnicity, it can place the participants in a vulnerable position of being identified. So for the purpose of protection, I haven't been very specific with ethnicity, because the group is so small at the management level. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. As Alan mentioned, my positionality, I'm a cisgendered East Asian woman. My parents came from Macau and Hong Kong respectively. Both were colonized cities at the time. So that's hence the postcolonial theory. I've been working on that because I'm very conscious now of the colonial mindset and needing to work on that. I have a kind of a unique position in that I'm like an insider in some ways. So I've been in a middle management role, and I'm now in a library administration role. And so I'm very conscious of, how I might skew things, or if I'm being overly positive, I'm very kind of conscious of what I'm saying and how I'm saying it, or the position that I'm in when I talk about this research. One thing I'm very conscious is also of the model minority myth, which is often reinforced. It's clearly a myth, but I hear it all the time. And I always sort of try to debunk it and talk about how it contributes to anti-Black racism. I also have privilege in that I've been able to access PD funds to attend lots of training. I've done the Harvard Institute. I've had all these different opportunities. So I recognize that my own personal experiences are going to be different from those who participated. And so I'm going to refrain from talking about my experience as much as I can, maybe in the question period, but for now I'm going to focus on the participants. So this is just an outline of the talk. I'm just going to give a background of the study, the purpose, the research question, and just a brief literature review. I'm going to talk about the methodology, why I chose to do what I did, which is use Bourdieu and use the survey method. And then I'm going to just do a thematic analysis of the open responses that were provided and talk a little more about institutional structures that reproduce dominant practices. And then we'll have a question period. So just a bit of the purpose. So this is where I will talk about a little bit about myself, but in connection to the purpose. So I was in a middle management role at the time when I was thinking about this research project. And I had racialized experiences. And I thought, oh, I wanted to improve on my management skills. I thought maybe I was the problem. So I started reading a lot, and I came across this book by Hyun, written in 2005 called Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, Career Strategies for Asians. And as I was reading it, I started to feel kind of icky because a lot of the text started to say, you know, you need to Westernize, you need to drink alcohol, you need to be able to socialize. And it had a very strong deficit narrative. And I thought, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. This is kind of problematic to put the blame on a group using very generalized assumptions and stereotypes. So I really wanted to counter this particular text with the intention of exploring, you know, those experiences are complex. Hyun sort of draws on their own experiences as a management consultant, working with managers who identify as Asian. But I think that there were just sort of small little cases, and I wanted to understand it in the library context, you know, what was happening. Hyun's more focused on the business corporate context. I wanted to understand what it was like in the academic world. I also wanted to include different perspectives specific to people that identified as Asian who are managers in libraries, and reframe that deficit narrative as a critical structuralist perspective, like what in the structure is not working rather than what is wrong with the person. So it was an extremely enlightening kind of moment of, oh yeah, maybe I need to look at something beyond myself, like it's all interactive, right? And then I wanted to explore the next steps and needs of people that identified as Asian, again, very broad, in management roles. So the research question that really drove this was what social or organizational structures and practices impact Asian librarians from management opportunities and or succeeding in management roles. So I just wanted to understand what kind of practices existed that kind of impacted this. So the methodology. So I really drew on Bourdieu. So this was 2019, FYI. I was just starting my PhD in Bourdieu. I was doing a lot of the social justice courses, and Bourdieu is heavily used in examining structure and oppression, and as well as how dominant practices are reproduced. So, I mean, now I've evolved. It's 2023, I'm very different. I'm drawing on critical race theory, postcolonial theory, and Bourdieu is just sort of there in the background. But at the time when I wrote this, Bourdieu was very much still at the forefront for me. It's a French sociologist who fought in the Algerian War and went back to school, became a sociologist, and studied how government structures and institutional structures, particularly around bureaucracy and many other things like cultural production, all kind of reproduce a narrative of, you know, what is considered elite and what is considered not elite, and how do you, how those social practices kind of separate those groups and are almost invisible, and we can't really, you know, you can't really put it into words sometimes, or, you know, it's very difficult to kind of talk about it because it's so complex with the different structures and influences. Bourdieu focuses a lot on power being maintained through social practice and constructions by with, you know, in society and within a group. And then the taking for granted practices is a really important piece, how it reproduces exclusion, or how it sort of separates groups and creates the social stratification. So Bourdieu eventually is, like many critical race scholars have begun to start to take Bourdieu and kind of utilize Bourdieu as like a jumping off board and breaking down Bourdieu a bit more. So Bourdieu examines that social stratification and like taking for granted invisible or accepted norms. And then Tika Van Kunda took Bourdieu's work and examined it through a critical race theory kind of perspective and said, you know, Bourdieu has some useful concepts that could be used in critical race theory. And Wallace also uses Bourdieu's specific area of capital to talk about how capital and race are connected. And then Yoso did a wonderful piece on how there are different forms of capital strength that certain communities embody that help them navigate predominantly white institutions, specifically higher education. So I chose the survey method because there was, when I looked at the data at the time, which wasn't a lot at the time, the numbers were so low for people that identified as Asian just broadly. And I thought, eek, what are the chances that all of us are managers? Well, that's not realistic, right? Like if you look at some of the data now, which I'll show shortly, like there still isn't much representation, even just from the group like racialized or BIPOC, the BIPOC group in general. So I was really worried about doing interviews because if I did interviews, there might be stories or things that would be very specific to that person. And I felt uncomfortable. I didn't want to put somebody in a vulnerable position. And at the same time, there wasn't really much research out there on East Asian or Asian managers and libraries. And so I was sort of like, oh, like, what do I do here? And so in the end, I was like, what are my values and principles? Well, I care about protecting my community, but I also want to understand and share this so we all build on it. Like sometimes you just got to start somewhere and build on that collectively through different studies and all that. So I wanted to just start somewhere. And then the survey was sent in 2019. Some of the advantages were, you know, it's just great, like a lot anonymized. I had no idea who was sending in responses. It was a very small population. It's a flexible questionnaire design that can be answered rapidly. So if you're a manager, you're likely going to be very busy and you don't have time to answer like a 1-hour survey. So I wanted to make sure that the questions could be answered in a short amount of time to just capture as much as I could. And then it's easy to send out surveys through like a large professional network. And kind of gather from there because we're all sort of across Canada and the US. I focused on both countries. Some of the disadvantages are I didn't get detailed responses. The full context isn't captured. I couldn't ask clarifying questions because it was anonymized. I couldn't follow up with people. And there was a high abandonment rate. And I wrote low response rate here, but I'm not even sure if it was a low response rate because again, I don't know how many Asian managers there are in Canada or the US. And I don't do the thing where you just kind of look on websites and look at people's last names. That would be so inappropriate. So I mean, my guess was the response rate was low. I had about 66, I think. But there was a lot of abandonment of the survey. And it could be that people just return to it later, or there were some people who would answer halfway and then leave the survey. Okay. So a bit about the results. So I did a call for participants and was sent out to various listservs and groups, Bimla, Gapala, and Kala. So 66 participants completed the full survey. Majority of participants were mostly early career, so 58%, followed by mid-career, 28%, and then late career, 14%. 80% of the participants identified as female, 16.92% identified as male, and 3.8% preferred not to answer. By the way, I totally acknowledge that's such a binary category, and I've done better. I'm now asking a very different question in my survey and research design. 53% of the participants were already in management roles and 47% were not in management roles. So we did have people who were not in management roles, but were possibly interested or wanted to, or just, that barrier couldn't get them to the management role. And a majority of the participants were in supervisory or middle management roles, 35%. So most were from academic libraries, 62%, followed by public libraries, 26%, and then special or other libraries was 12%. So here I just broadened it. So they're just break it down just a little bit. So 52% identified as East Asian, 21% identified as Southeast Asian, 6% as South Asian, and then 21% identified as multiracial or multi-ethnic. In terms of education, 6% just had a bachelor's, 84.9% of course had a master's degree, and then 9% of the participants had a doctorate. So when I sort of collected all the survey responses and they were rating different areas of barriers on a scale of extremely negative to no negative, influence, or I don't know, the two categories that had strong either extremely negative or negative influence, where there was less visibilities of Asian in management roles in society, and less visible Asians in management roles at their own organization that was a negative influence. And you'll see if you add in minimally negative, that number obviously is quite large. But when we get to the organizational barriers piece, this is where I'm really interested in that. The lack of diversity policies or programs within the institution to encourage the advancement of people of color was perceived to be like very negative or negative, has a negative influence in their pursuit of management, or, a barrier in their, interest in management. And the other one was lack of diversity training that addresses Asian stereotypes or staff. And then the lack of mentorship programs for people of color. So in this particular, I think this part really interested me because what it tells me is there's a lack of investment from the institution and management in providing that kind of support for not only the Asian community, but also the institution, so that, the diversity training piece is really helpful in kind of talking about these stereotypes that can be really harmful, like the ones that Hyun sort of reiterated in her book. And, it's these kind of stereotypes, even though people might think it's not severe, is actually quite harmful to the community and really can cause a lot of issues in advancement of career, as well as one's own self-confidence and one's own belief of one's own power to pursue these positions. So then I did a sort of open response piece, and I did a thematic analysis of the open responses. So using Bourdieu's Illusio and Habitus, I kind of look at, there was like themes of that. So Illusio is basically the idea that all social games seen from the outside seem to be games of illusion, but the essence of the game is to produce the kind of habitus, so behaviors or like just a disposition that does not call the game into question, and to attract players who so profoundly adapted to the game that they never ask questions about the game. So basically you're either you either fit into the game, or you learn how to play the game and you assimilate and adjust yourself to the game. If you're in the game, your belief is, these are the rules, this is how it goes, there's nothing wrong with it, I've been doing this forever. I've never had issues. So the belief is illusion, like they think that things are fair, but they're not listening to what's around them or what's happening, because again, they're stuck in this illusion that because they're in the game, that the game is fair. And so they look for people with similar dispositions, behaviors, attitudes, because they believe this is the game, this is the rules. To be a manager, you have to be this. You have to act like this. You have to communicate in a certain way. So here's an example of somebody who's sharing something where they've had this like challenge where they've experienced moving up the corporate ladder are more subtle. As a first generation immigrant, I don't have some of the cultural connections that others share when networking, playing hockey or golf. I worked in public libraries for many years before moving to academic libraries. There were many women in leadership positions, but few people of color. Of the people of color, there were fewer women of color. So here the idea is that the game is you have to be able to play hockey or golf. This is just how things are, and not questioning the kind of structure that continually says we are only interested in certain people who do certain things. So this is an illusion that many administrators have, that they tend to believe, we've always done things like this, and it's always worked for us, and we always recruit the best because we do these things. So this is clearly an example of how exclusion can come into play, because the belief is the current structure is working and therefore we don't need to question it, or the belief in that illusion. Capital and misrecognition was also a theme that I noticed quite a bit in the open responses. So here I'm going to specifically refer to meritocracy as like, so capital being like economic capital, social capital, or there's like symbolic capital. All of that matters in terms of building your status and being accepted into elite groups. And here I think it's more, this belief of the meritocracy is an objective system that instills the idea that whenever your social position at Borough Society ought to offer enough opportunity and mobility for talent to combine with effort to rise to the top. So the issue here is that there's misrecognition when we believe that the meritocracy is fair, that we assess people based on the capital that they have is fair, not recognizing that privilege varies and that particular groups have particular privileges and capital that allow them to thrive or navigate the particular meritocratic structure that's in place. An example I'll give is for like mentorship was I think one of the issues that was raised. Access to mentorship helps kind of like usher in opportunities, helps you navigate, let's say, even salary negotiations, things like that. So people who have that network, who have that privilege of already having built that network, will advance more quickly than those who might be coming from a working class background, entering the profession, not having to build that network from scratch, and being kind of left out from that opportunity, or not having the kind of years of support that some others might have. So here, one participant shares, like, both colleagues in hiring panels and supervisors had expectations of Asian women as demure and introverted and not well suited for upper leadership. I had to work twice as hard to dissuade them of that notion. I was also repeatedly offered lower salaries than my male counterparts at the managerial levels, even though I negotiated. And I had to negotiate in comparison to my male counterparts, I learned later, to achieve status and par. So that kind of idea that, oh, negotiation is part of the process. It's part of like the not only the game, but it's sort of recognized in some ways as this is the skill or capital that you need to gain on your own. So very individualistic, and that it's fair because the negotiation process is we're supposed to know our value and then ask for that value. And oftentimes what I find with this particular idea of like negotiations and salaries is, for example, I had one colleague share that they actually tried to negotiate in one job for a managerial position, and they were told, we're not negotiating, you're not going to get a salary raise. And then when they found out that their salary was much lower compared to people who were in similar positions, who were identified as white male, they were just told, well, why didn't you negotiate? That's you're supposed to push harder. That's the game. You're supposed to be aggressive. You're supposed to be, and this is on you, you know, you have lack experience in salary negotiations. So using that kind of like that, this is how it is, like the merit here measured is your ability to be aggressive, to get what you want, not recognizing that we all express in different ways, and it kind of tends to favor one particular type of person who might communicate in a particular way. Another thematic analysis is symbolic capital. Symbolic capital is almost like a way of legitimizing a person. Like it's almost like a status that's invisible. You don't have to be extremely wealthy, but you know, if you've got economic capital and social capital and cultural capital, so the kind of the cultural engagement that you have or knowledge that you have, that all kind of works to give you status as a person, so people perceive you in a different way. So like, let's say you're wearing Louis Vuitton, or sorry, Gucci loafers, and you show up to work, and you know, people notice you're well dressed. You talk about going to you know, on a yacht to some island like every year. You know, all those kind of things kind of exude a status that makes like people who are from the same group accept you into their group. So you could say the same with managerialism or managers, is that, you know, managers look for similar people. So they're looking for people that maybe act or communicate or dress a certain way, or how they hold themselves. And all of that kind of contributes to that legitimization. Oh, you know, this person is, I remember one colleague shared that they were told if they dressed better, that they would likely get a management role, but because they dressed so sloppily, or, you know, they were always wearing just dress shirts and pants, and they weren't, you know, it wasn't, they just needed to work on their wardrobe, which, you know, that's the kind of legitimization that managers try to kind of rationalize, like, oh, you have to look like a manager. And when that helps to kind of reinforce racism, right? You don't look like a manager. You don't seem like a manager, is what some of them will try to say. So Bourdieu explains that dominant groups break silence only when ordered to do so by being questioned. These groups then claim to justify themselves, drawing on their own resources spontaneously to invent a sociodicy, reflecting the principle of legitimation that underpins them. So the only time an elite group will ever bring into question their structure or their world is if somebody challenges them, and then they break silence and rationalize why that structure works or why that structure should continue to work, and then further try to legitimize it through whatever rationale. Usually it's through like commentary around professional standards, or they use data or statistics and they try to legitimize things, but we know that all of that can be manipulated and shifted to suit a narrative, right? So here somebody shares that this lack of support from executive leadership, the refusal to address the serious lack of diversity and inclusion training in my organization, and the audacity to blame a person for an organization's institutional racism have greatly affected my professional goals. It was not explicitly said, but this individual implied that if I had issues with the organization, I may not be the right fit, quotation marks, for the library. And as we all know, this is me, side note, as we all know, that is clearly a very problematic way of thinking. With this in mind, I am no longer motivated to pursue management roles, while moving to a managerial position would increase my ability to bring about change. Having to deal with discrimination and microaggressions from senior administration and from my organization would hinder me from being a proper manager to other staff. So this person has unfortunately experienced something where they've been this kind of lack of support or refusal to kind of address the racism, is a way of saying, you know, things are working the way they are. You just need to do better, or it's on you that this is not, that you're not in these roles. So again, blaming others, reinforcing a deficit narrative. So very much trying to rationalize that all managers look maybe a certain way or do things a certain way, and that there's a right fit for a manager. So here are some considerations with the study. I just first want to touch on Hyun's book again, because again, this was the text that kind of started it all for me. And this is actually just straight from the book's back cover. And Hyun writes, "You're educated and ambitious. Sure, the hours are long and corporate politics are a bane, but you focus on getting the job done, confident that you will be rewarded in the long run. Yet somehow your hard work isn't paying off. And you watch from the sidelines as your colleagues get promoted. Those who make it to management positions in this intensely competitive corporate environment seem to understand an unwritten code for marketing and aligning themselves politically. Furthermore, your strong work ethic and raw intelligence were sufficient when you started at the firm, but now they're expecting you to be a rainmaker who can bring in clients and exert influence on others. The top of the career ladder seems beyond your reach. Perhaps you've hit the bamboo ceiling." So here it's quite interesting because it seems like Hyun's sort of doing a compliment, like, hey, you're really good at what you do, but it's somehow you're just not making it past that bamboo ceiling. And so initially when I read this, I was like, oh, maybe it's going to talk about institutional structures, how I can navigate it, you know, what's problematic in the institution, or all of these structural elements. But it ended up being a text that was pretty much focusing on why the Asian culture is not a match for the white workplace. And so this was highly problematic for me. And so you can see like where these kinds of texts that are published and given to people like me, how it reinforces this ideology that Bourdieu talks about, is this reinforcement that, hey, the structure's okay, everything's fine, you just got to work on you. You just don't get it, you know? So I'm just going to unpack this further. So Hyun sort of talked a bit actually in the book about foreign people. I put this in quotation marks because it was very broad, how they need to be educated in Western ways. So how they need to shake people's hands, how they need to be able to go have a beer with their boss, all these kind of really strange kind of assumptions and stereotypes reinforcing this kind of dominant culture. Asians are generalized and essentialized as being culturally incompetent, or the ceiling is of one's own creation. So very much victim blaming or the deficit narrative. The other sort of part of the book also talked about how white managers need to mentor Asian people to help them understand the workplace and culture, which is very much that white savior narrative. So it places the white manager in the place of, you know best, so now you have to help these people don't know anything, rather than talk about how white managers need to reflect on their own positionality and how they reinforce whiteness in the workplace and racism as well. And it's written and aimed at the business sector. So a lot of the citations are mostly from the business literature and research. So it doesn't really take a critical lens. It's more like reinforcing the dominant business literature that typically has that like this fake neutrality, like we're doing a neutral study on, and this is what we're finding with certain populations, and then just reporting that without unpacking the complexity of those experiences. So Hyun actually received a bit of backlash, not widely, but there was a bit of criticism, very obviously, with Hyun's book. And so in 2012, Hyun wrote a piece to kind of redress or kind of like pull things back a bit, and wrote in an article in Leader to Leader, and says, flips the issue from Asians need to aspire to whiteness instead to corporations that should support talent, but instead makes it a business case. So stating that, oh, it's just good for business to have Asians as managers. So with that business case for diversity, there are sort of remnants of capitalism, like you're only recruiting so you can make money. So that can be also a very problematic narrative, right? And many critical race scholars talk about this, about how like that kind of capitalism and using race as a capital to fill ranks for better business is problematic. So I really sort of I talked about near the end of my chapter about reframing this idea of like the bamboo ceiling instead of, us constructing that ceiling. That ceiling is actually like a structural systematic issue. So I think one of the big things is how leadership should look like or act like. And diversity isn't just about skin color or race or ethnicity. Diversity is like different approaches to communicating, different styles in how you work with staff. We have to recognize the strengths of people, and what they bring to that role as well in different ways. So that idea that a manager should act a certain way really tries to encourage assimilation. And I think assimilation reinforces ideologies like whiteness and white supremacy. Reflecting on how leadership and management are being defined in the academic field. So I think it's really important that like a lot of the leadership and management literature is still rooted in business and organizational studies. And I think there needs to be more of a critical lens being brought to that literature so that they're examining common practices and dominant practices through a critical framework rather than the typical org studies or managerial studies school of thought, which is just basically this like self-perpetuating narrative of, managers are the center, managers are right, managers are always, they always have certain qualities or characteristics. I remember when I would do a lot of leadership and management training. Sorry, I'm inserting a bit of myself here. No, I'll wait till the end. Sorry. So we want to also create inclusive spaces and workplace culture that respects different approaches to management and or leadership. So, just understanding that managers from all walks of life will choose to kind of express how they lead or how they manage things in different ways. And we have to recognize the strengths that brings in different contexts. So maybe one managerial style is great in a particular team because of social dynamic or whatever the work is, and maybe another style works for another space. So recognizing there's no one perfect ideal manager, that rather this is all contextual, and we have to be very aware and curious about what works for everyone. And then reviewing common practices for promotion to management. So moving away from subject expertise as managerial qualities, but rather the kind of communication people skills that managers can bring, and how people communicate in different ways, things like that. So for future research, what I want to really strongly emphasize is this is a study that is just the beginning. It's not perfect. I know it's not perfect, and I don't expect it to be perfect. There really isn't much out there. And I really want to encourage people to explore this further, because I think there should be more voices. It shouldn't sort of lie on me, like it shouldn't just be me doing this, because I only represent one view, right? Each person here today will represent a different view, might bring a different kind of perspective or analysis to this research. So I want to strongly encourage to kind of see this as just a perspective, but we need more perspectives on this issue, on this topic. And, you know, whether it be positive or like a counter narrative, or, you know, a way to do interviews that can really highlight maybe certain parts of the experience that need work, that need support, things like that. So ideally, if I could do this again, I would love to do a longer survey with more extensive questioning, or interviews to have that kind of understanding of the context, because everybody's situation is going to be unique in what they experience. And also our identities are complex. We're not just Asian. We have all sorts of different identities that kind of we have to navigate, you know, these institutions with. And so it would also bring a light to the complexity of each person's experiences. Yeah, I think it's really important to continue research on the dominant practices in management that produce this like ideal type of manager that is like this myth. And I think it's important to unpack that on a constant basis to identify whether we're perpetuating like white supremacy, you know, what kind of narratives are we sowing into new graduates from library school, or people who want to go into management, or people who are averse to management because they think managers are a certain way. I think in order to kind of shift that culture, we need to really support that, you know, managerial practice will look different for everyone, and that's okay, rather than say, you know, managers they take charge, they lead, and you can lead and you can take charge, but it doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't have to be, you know, expressed in one certain way. And one thing I will say, which I feel embarrassed saying now, because actually a few new reports just came out. So I did these slides way back when. So I think Carl and ACRL really need to report more extensively on the experiences of the different ethnicities and racialized groups, or BIPOC groups, to understand where they are in the field, and what they're, you know, why the numbers are so low in certain areas. And I'm going to share some reports here. First, I'm going to show my references because I want to be a good librarian. And then I'm just going to switch to. Okay, so this is a recent Carl report. This is the Canadian Association for Research Libraries. And here you'll see a breakdown. Again, it's very broad. Racialized can include anybody who identifies as BIPOC or racialized. And you'll see here at the senior leaders level, the dotted line is the sort of the representation of the racialized group that was studied or interviewed, or sorry, surveyed. And then the red bar here is the number of racialized librarians in senior leader roles. And then here compared to the white people that identify as white, and you'll see that that is quite a wide gap. And you'll see here in managers and our department unit heads, I mean, you know, racialized persons overall is somewhat matching with people who are in that position. And then, of course, we're mostly here in the functional specialists and in staffing. This report's quite extensive, by the way, so I'll plug the link in actually so people can grab it here. And then the other report is By Any Measure, which came out from Ithaca. Alan, are you able to see it? I'm not sure if I switched tabs and
Yes, I can see.
Okay. Sometimes I never know with Zoom. So yeah, you'll see here this low representation, and that means it can be very challenging in terms of representation and those leadership roles. I couldn't find much information on this particular report about where Asians sort of lie in terms of the senior leadership roles or managerial roles. So that would be something that we would need to understand more of. So I think that's it for me. Stopped sharing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sylvia, for this really wonderful presentation. I'm glad we're recording this because I got to go back into it and review some of the titles that you mentioned and some of the really excellent points you've made. So to the audience, please enter your question into the Q&A chat box, and we can select from those questions to Sylvia. But so as you're doing that, everyone, I have a question to Sylvia. I've been recently reading a book by Laura Wong from Harvard University. I don't know if you've come across her work. She published a book called Edge. I'm just going to send this out to the audience there. And she does touch on what Hyun said in terms of the bamboo ceiling and some of the things like that. But it's really an updated sort of discussion about that book as well in terms of using your edge, acknowledging your disadvantages, and rather being angry about the injustice, to actually lean into your disadvantage, your disadvantages, and lean into it, turning it into sort of an advantage. And how do you stand out from the dominance group, using authenticity, not playing the game, but rather how to redefine yourself. And I want to ask you a question, Sylvia, having sort of been in managerial roles and in the position that you are today, what are some of the things that you can share with us in terms of your success in being yourself and not trying to necessarily play the game? How have you been able to define authenticity and really share your values as you move up the management ladder?
Oh, that one's a tough one for me. Because I wish I could give that perfect answer to say, yeah, I like stuck to it and I was, I powered through all of that crap. But I think I struggled in the beginning when I first entered my first management role. I think I was trying to be someone that I wasn't. And so I tried to be authoritative type of manager, and it really backfired on me. So when I decided, no, this isn't for me, and I just don't want to do this because it's like, I feel like it doesn't represent me as a person, and I would be putting on a mask every day to pretend to be somebody else based on what kind of standards I was told. So I had people tell me, you gotta be tough with your team. You gotta like go in your first meeting and lay down the ground rules. That's the advice somebody gave me. And I made that mistake by listening to that advice. And I think the second year when I realized it wasn't working and I switched it up and I said, I'm just going to be myself. And I met with the team and I said, listen, I'm so sorry about the last year. I'm going to do better. I'm going to start, listening, and we're going to take a very collaborative approach because I'm a mediator. I like to kind of have group conversations. And so I started, instead of that like very top heavy decision-making stuff, I started to adjust how I ran my meetings and how I talked to the team. And I remember at a leadership meeting, I was sitting around the table. It was all white men, by the way. And somebody said, listen, just tell your team they got to start doing this weeding project. We're going to work on it. Here's the date, blah, blah, blah. They just told me directly, right? And I said, you know what? Actually, I'm going to talk to my team to see if we have capacity for that. We have some ongoing projects and I would like to check in with my team first. And then another manager went, you're the manager. Why are you checking in on your team? You're supposed to just tell them what to do. And I kind of had to like say, actually, I am the manager and this is what I want to do. And it kind of took them all aback. And afterwards, they I kept reiterating the same narrative over and over again. And I was very respectful. I wasn't like rude about it or overly aggressive. I was just like, this is how I do things, like accept it. And I got a lot of great feedback from my team about how that shift really made them feel included. They felt like operationally we were more in sync with each other because we were constantly communicating, and then we were also making decisions as a group, and I was mediating that. And then also I was an added barrier to the aggression that some of the managers were expressing with these technicians. So I think as soon as I kind of sort of stuck to what my values and principles were, and that's how I sort of have chosen to operate, is what are my values and principles. I always sort of revisit them, and if that is it, then that's integrity, right? You stick with it. But I think then they started to recognize me as the manager that has to check in with their team. But they did it more respectfully as the time went on, and they understood that it was just it kind of created a really positive atmosphere. And one of the managers came to me a couple years later and said, how do you do it? How do you make everybody like each other? And I was like, I don't know. I don't like scream at people or tell them like they have to do something. We have a discussion. So I mean, I think part of that shift in culture and doing it alone, I do want to be real and honest, doing it alone is very difficult. And I luckily have a very good network of friends and who are in the profession, who I talk to. And I even have friends who are not in the profession, who are managers. And we talk about it all the time, and we kind of bounce ideas. And it's really incredibly helpful to have a social network of people supporting you as you're trying to kind of navigate this really complex environment and trying to stick to your own values and principles. It's tough. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your experiences. I really like that you have that network to draw from. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Actually, and I should cite YOSO 2005, Community Cultural Wealth, using Bourdieu's idea of capital, identifies that in the Latinx community, like a lot of those forms of capital, such as like the community-related capital, like navigational capital, so learning to navigate predominantly white institutions through your own personal network, or like family capital, the support, like not necessarily family in the sense of like by blood, but a family of people that support you through that experience. Like, and she identifies multiple forms of capital, but we have that strength in some of us have that strength, and that can help us navigate that really tough environment.
Thanks to the audience for asking questions and putting it to Silvia. I'm just going to go in terms of the order here. There's a question about Bourdieu's term sociodicee. Can you define that a little bit more? Give us sort of a bit of an explanation, introduction to it.
So, okay, first off, Bourdieu is like, I don't know if any of you have encountered Bourdieu or read any of Bourdieu's original work, but Bourdieu is a very messy writer. A lot of people I've spoke to who studied Bourdieu confirm that it's just Bourdieu. And so Bourdieu's sociodicee is like sort of like social life, like it's kind of like the social norms and the kind of all those kind of contribute to particular behaviors. Just putting it simply, but Bourdieu would probably explain this in like a 300-pager. So I don't know if I'm doing it justice, but that's my interpretation of Bourdieu's work.
It's an excellent term to put into this context. So that's great. I have a question about I'm curious about these narratives you mentioned that tell about the expectations of managers clashing between supervisory expectations and stereotypes, I think, which is important and ought to be interrogated more. Do you have any more thoughts on this?
Oh, absolutely. I have tons of thoughts on this. So I think, so just a clarifying question, for narratives, what do you mean, like the narratives that organizations kind of perpetuate, or narratives like in reference to like the narratives of managers? Sorry, I don't know if the attendee can.
Yeah, I think perhaps our audience member can sort of add more to that in the chat box here. But I think from my interpretation, the narratives of the experiences that you shared with us from the presentation. We'll start with that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I think it's important not to be, yes, absolutely. So one of the things I wanted to, I really wanted to explore the kind of, I guess if we use the term narrative, the narratives that are often given to Asian people in terms of leadership. I thought that was something also I really wanted to unpack, in part because when I first entered my managerial role, my first managerial role, somebody came up to me and said, are you going to have a slinky spine, Sylvia? Are you going to just bend over backwards and just agree to everything? And I thought, what the heck? Okay, first off, my mother can confirm that I am not somebody that agrees to everything. And that, it's this narrative of of course we know, because if we look at the Asian critical theory literature, like Asian women are often kind of have this stereotype of being demure or like infantilized, or, just like overly agreeable. So I think those really negative narratives really impacted me and my experiences, at least for me. And I think it's worth unpacking further to see how this kind of plays out. Oh, thank you, Melissa. Narratives from supervisees, especially those in dysfunctional workplaces, complaining that managers, yes. So I just shared how somebody told me I would have a slinky spine, blah, blah, blah. And that impacted me. So it's not just even managers, it's employees or supervisees that can really impact that experience. And I think that would be worth looking into, because I continually face that kind of infantilization. Like, I'm a 40-year-old woman, and the other day somebody tried to explain like having children or something, and I'm like, I'm 40, I have like 2 kids. Why are you telling me what it's like to have kids? And the assumption was I was so young that I didn't have kids, and it was just like a weird conversation from a supervisor or an employee. But these happen day to day, and it can be so harmful because it can burn somebody out. And I think we also have to look at burnout. I think that would be an interesting study, looking at the retention and burnout that racialized managers experience in these roles. I know that in some different areas, like in higher education, that certainly is the case in some studies. I hope that answers your question, Melissa.
Great. Thanks, Sylvia. The next question, how to unpack this one? This is a great question. How can IPOC library workers and academic and public libraries collaborate, share experiences, strategies, and possible solutions? These are issues throughout the library sector.
Okay, so how can... That's a great question. I'm sort of hemming and hawing on this because I'm not sure with the public library system what kind of complexities there are, because you have the patron base might be very different from academic libraries, and some of that harm you experience as a manager that identifies as Asian can also come from patrons, not just supervisees. And so I think to collaborate and share these experiences, I think we first need to identify it strongly as an issue. And I think by, doing those presentations, publishing on the topic, and making it like searchable, like if you look for these kind of issues, in relation in the library context, they're hard to find. And I think what it could be perceived as is not an issue because there's no research on it. And I think first we really need to kind of contribute to that literature and that research to say, no, this is an issue, here are the voices, and give that platform to people to talk about it in that way. I mean, this is sort of, I'm wondering if this is also the associations that need to kind of focus on that and really look at projects at like studying the different experiences of these groups, and then, you know, giving these reports to ACRL or Carl so that they can advocate for these groups and with the institutions. So it's not the best answer, but that's what I can think of for now. I'm probably going to go to bed tonight and keep thinking about it. I'm so sorry.
Maha Kumaran, who's a past chair and founder of
Maha.
Suggests we could be doing this through Vimblog. Absolutely. That's one avenue that we try to sort of connect people together and also have these types of programs where we can share ideas and also share experiences as well. I think that's really great point that Maha makes. So thanks for reminding me of Vimblog.
Hi, Maha.
Next question. Can you talk about BIPOC conforming into management ideal types and its effectiveness and or perpetuation of harm of others?
Yeah, so this is the other piece of my research, which is in critical management studies. I'm not going to plug my book, I swear. So anyway, I'm doing this research in critical management studies. And one of the things, actually, let me plug in Helena Liu's citation. It's a really great book on the whiteness in leadership and management texts and media, and how this ideal managerial type is reinforced in the media through CEOs, talking about the whole neoliberal feminist, the lean in kind of narrative of, you just got to work hard and you'll get there kind of thing. I'm gonna try to pull up Liu's. No, don't plug my book, Cecilia. I'm embarrassed, sorry. Let me just, actually, this would be a nice citation here to, I love you, Cecilia. Okay. So this is, Liu also has a book that talks about this kind of narrative of the white knights, or like whiteness being kind of weaved into the literature, into the media. And so I think that's been sort of largely ignored, except by critical race or critical management studies scholars. And I think we don't talk about it enough, because when I did leadership and management training, it was sort of talked about in a very neutral way. There was never ever criticisms on the ideologies we were perpetuating, like colonial mindsets of, superiority at the top, or, the dehumanizing of labor. So treating workers like cogs instead of human beings, and making the workplace a more complex idea. So I think that's some of the stuff that I've been kind of exploring. And I think when we do those leadership institutes or those managerial kind of courses, I think we have to be more critical and really ask, like, what kind of readings are here? Are they mostly from the business or management sector? Do they come from elsewhere? Are they from, education, social work? All these different areas also produce leadership literature that's very much rooted in social justice. You don't see that. Like when I did the Harvard Institute, there was none of that. We were just reading like business and management literature. So even though libraries are supposedly a social institution, we were drawing from the corporate sector. So I think that's some of the issues, is how we're training and how we're educating librarians and library students on what management's supposed to be, what it looks like, and what field it comes from. And it really should be a representation of different fields and different voices.
Thank you everyone for these great questions that are coming in. So I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But these are wonderful questions from everyone here. Next one is, so much awareness has been raised about the challenges faced by Asian or other POCs in libraries. What concrete actions have benefited racialized library workers since these conversations, webinars such as today's, and research, etc., have been going on recently? What have libraries, library associations, library information schools done to bring about change? The answer is sadly,
uh,
yikes.
oh, do I start talking about my PhD research? No, I'm going to refrain from that because it could go on forever. I think that the concrete actions, I think I certainly noticed it though, at least from, I'm going to talk about my personal experience. I don't want to speak for everyone. Everybody's going to have a different experience. For me, it's certainly, I've noticed there's more interest in recruitment. So I get emails all the time, like, will you apply to this job? Or we're looking to hire an associate university librarian at this institution. Can you apply? In the back of my mind, and I hate that I'm saying this, or even thinking it, I just think, oh no, are they just picking me because I'm like some check mark? And I think I struggle with that a lot. But at the end of the day, I kind of go, okay, no, you've got experience, you have managerial experience. They're looking to kind of restore or correct whatever what their institution has issues with, which is diversity. And okay, I am going to talk about my PhD research. And I interviewed faculty and some librarians who were doing equity work and anti-racism work in the universities. And some of them were saying, yes, because of all these social movements, these wonderful social movements that have brought something to light, it's made like a sort of awareness that makes it easier to talk about. It's still not easy to talk about, but it is easier. And it's giving space now to these conversations, allowing people like me or other racialized or BIPOC people to kind of advocate for that change. Even now when I'm in hirings, when I talk about, recognizing strength in different ways, people kind of go, oh yeah, like maybe our bias is like leaning towards one particular way of talking or communicating. And then so there's more of a conversation to talk about it. I'm not shut down as quickly as I used to be, where I would kind of bring up, oh, this person has potential, we should look past their name. They're really like, well educated, all of that. It's like in the past, I would have been like, oh, ignored. But now people are like, oh yeah, we should listen. So in some ways, it's given me that kind of social power to say, we need this, or we need to do this. And I kind of leveraged that social power in my position to advocate for that. So on a micro level, it's helped me. Now on a larger level, I'm not entirely sure. That it can vary. I think it depends on where you are, what your institution is, all of that.
Thanks, Silvia. That's a really great answer. Next question is a really good one. How do you build and maintain a long-term mutual and beneficial relationship with a mentor, especially white mentors?
I had an interesting conversation actually with somebody in the career services at TMU the other day, and we were just, because the idea of mentorship came up, and this particular person works with like BIPOC racialized students and building mentorship networks. And we were having coffee, and I was like, we were talking about mentorship in general, and this person goes, I think mentorship it can look different for different people. She's seen some mentorship relationships as being transactional. So we're going to have coffee. I'm going to give you the information you need, and you're going to go off and do whatever. Or, there's like some kind of transaction, and you only reach out when you need something. And then the other person puts it on their CV that they're a mentor or something like that. But then this person also shared, but she found with like certain racialized communities, it's not like a one mentor transactional type of relationship. It's this kind of community that comes together, and each person in that community offers something that kind of supports that person's growth. So like in terms of building and maintaining that long-term mutually beneficial relationship, I found with all my mentors, both racialized and white, it's always been a friendship for me. Like I still have coffee with these people, like even when I've left an institution, it's, for me, I think that for me, that's what works for me. I don't know if that answers your question. I think everyone's going to be different though.
Thanks for sharing your insights, Sylvia. Next question is, kudos to you for standing up to people, Sylvia. Your example, people telling you to quote unquote be the manager, is an example of saboteurism. Can you speak to this from experience? Saboteurs can also be other minorities as well.
Oh, that's such an interesting term. Yeah, so can you speak to this from experience? Yeah, I mean, I think if you step into these roles, you will constantly be told how you are supposed to act. It's not just going to be other managers, it's going to be HR, it's going to be staff. And I think, again, like, I think for me, I always like stick to my values and principles as much as I can. And I try to have a conversation with these people because it kind of comes from somewhere. And actually that manager that told me to, be a manager and just tell your staff, what to do. I actually had a one-on-one with them and I said, listen, like, why did you impose this on me? And it turned out this manager had a negative experience because they used to formerly managed the same team and then left because they didn't like this manager's approach. And so I thought, okay, this is coming from somewhere. And so I just sort of had a very respectful conversation where I said, listen, let me do my thing. And if it doesn't work, I'll come to you for advice. But, let me try this out on my own in my way. Because, obviously you wouldn't want somebody coming in telling you what to do. And he kind of backed off and said, fine, like, I understand. And I think setting those boundaries, like those kind of boundaries are really important with anyone that tries to tell you what to do, or how you should do things, beyond like legal stuff, because HR will tell you legally you can't do that or something like that. Obviously listen to that, but often I'll have to set boundaries. Like, I appreciate your feedback, but this is what I'd like to try. Can you let me do this? If I need more feedback from you, I will get it from you, but I'd like you to respect that, I'm in this role. And I find people tend to pull back. But I have to say, like, there's a lot of emotional labor because it takes every fiber of my body to not scream when somebody's like constantly telling you what to do and you're like, what? And so I always have to kind of put that emotional labor piece in and go, be very calm, talk to them about boundaries, all of that.
Emotional labor, that's a term that I identify with, as many racialized individuals probably have as well. So yes, thanks for sharing that with us, Sylvia. I have a question here. How can Asian library workers deal with the guilt of not wanting to be a manager, but also wanting to change things without being a manager?
Yeah. Oh no, don't feel guilty. Don't feel guilty. it's oh, I feel terrible that if anybody feels guilt, they shouldn't. I mean, you can still make changes. I think I have several colleagues and friends that talk about, leading on committees, doing the equity work, and in fact, being more nimble because they're not held back by managerial parameters. Being in the union and being able to advocate for equity through the union. So I think there are ways to lead where you and make change without being a manager, and you should never feel guilty for your choices. You know yourself best. So, and yeah, like and I think that's important, is like understanding that leadership and managers are not the same thing. They're always conflated as the same, but leadership is actually very different. It's, leading, actually like doing the work and taking that action. And being a manager is, there's the kind of bureaucratic aspect to it, and a manager might lead, but they might not. So, yeah.
Wonderful. I have a question here. Do you have advice on how to effectively advocate for yourself or for your team during interactions with people with more power than you, especially people who are ignorant of systematic racism? What are some challenges that you faced in such situations? I'm going to put this into the chat box as well here.
Yeah. I feel very comfortable advocating, so I just ask for things. And I'm not shy about it. I think you can all tell I'm very like pretty direct, and I think that certainly has helped me. I think this goes back to the study, actually, like having that network, that support institutionally helps a great deal. In my manager role, I found that when I had support from the university librarian or the dean of libraries, that made a world of difference. I think it's, again, going back to the institutional barrier piece, these senior leaders need to support racialized managers. And when I say support, I don't just mean like funding training. It means in a meeting, when I say, I need this, or this is my boundary, that dean of libraries or university librarian backs you up and says, we're going to respect that. And, we're not going to, we're going to respect the decision. We're going to support the decision that this manager has made. And I've been very fortunate at my last library to have a very supportive university librarian who, and partly because we were both the only women in librarians at this library, and we bonded over that, but would back me up in meetings and say, Silvia is head of public services. During the pandemic, she's asking for this. We're going to respect that. And so she helped really ensure that my advocacy went somewhere by being that secondary voice to support me. And I think that made a world of difference for me.
Sylvia, we're running low or near the end of the program. I'm going to ask one last question here. It's a really good one. And that has to do with, do you have advice or research on how Asian American or Asian Canadian women can manage predominantly white teams and the kind of barriers that they in particularly are likely to face?
Yeah, I feel like I could write a whole book on this. You know what? This is a tough one. I think, by the way, if I should drop my email. If you want to follow up after, because we're short on time, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to just do a Zoom to chat. Thanks, Cecilia. And like, because sometimes some of this is all like, depending on your context, or, it's specific to my experience, or even if you just want to have a conversation, I just want to be open to everyone who's attended here. I think one of the things that I've had to really navigate was understanding the social norms that exist in predominantly white spaces. That was the biggest challenge for me. And understanding that people will find me and my demeanor, communication style very different, and then learning to be okay with that and not try to assimilate. That resistance part was very difficult for me, because I am a bit of a people pleaser. I'm working on it. But I think for these predominantly white spaces, I did rely a lot on, again, my university librarian. We would have meetings, I would ask questions, and she'd provide advice. And I'd kind of navigate the social situations very carefully. I mean, I don't think we should, in all honesty, when I look back on the years that I was there at my last place, that I should have suggested other norms. And that's one of my regrets, is not advocating more for different ways of operating meetings, different ways of communicating. Yeah, I think, I don't know if that's the best answer, but I think it's because I'm still reflecting on that experience, having just left my last institution just a year ago. So yeah, that's the best answer I could give right now.
And it's difficult to answer that, right, Sylvia, because we continually evolve, and you're learning along the way as well, and teams change so much. So definitely a difficult question. Well, I want to thank you, Sylvia, for joining us and being able to present some of your research for today's webinar. I also like to just talk a little bit about VimLock. Over the past decade, VimLock has provided a forum for visible minority librarians across Canada to discuss issues and concerns specifically related to the profession. With initiatives such as our mentorship program, Census of Visible Minority Librarians in Canada, and more recently, educational programming such as today's webinar. So a lot of our members are from Canada, but today's we have a lot of our audience members from the United States as well. So this is the first time, and I think this is a really good beginning to future collaboration as well. I want to give a shout out to Ray Pun, who helped also share this with our American friends and colleagues as well in the States. And for future events, please go to our website, vimlockwordpress.com. And if you have a suggestion for a future speaker or program idea, we'd love to hear from you as well. Today's program is recorded, so we will follow up with everyone with email about the link to this recording, also some notes, and also link to Sylvia's presentation as well. Well, that's all, everyone. Welcome to VimLock and some of the programs that we've had, including today's, and we'll see you again fairly soon for our next program. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.